Hi there and welcome to the talk today. My name is Jeremy Borrelli. I'm the staff archaeologist with the program in Maritime Studies at East Carolina University. We'll be joined later on by Dr. Nathan Richards, who's the director of the program in Maritime Studies. And our talk today is titled Modeling Methodologies for Site Management and Preservation Assessment, a Post-World War II Landing Craft Utility Case Study in the Republic of the Marshall Islands. So I'd like to first start off with how this project sort of came about, and it came as sort of an offshoot of the partnership, the wonderful partnership the ECU has with the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, or DPAA. And in April of 2019, Dr. Jason Raup was planning to run a DPAA mission in Kwajalein, but for various reasons that had to be pushed to the fall semester of that year. And so while during that initial time frame, Dr. Raup was able to do a recon assessment of the site, while also while he was there, he was also able to scope out potential field school sites, because the time frame of the new DPA project was sort of lined up with when ECU typically runs its fall field schools. And so while Dr. Raup was there at that original date in April, he was able to do a bit of recon, and what he found was that the best sort of candidate was a site known as the Ski Area LCM, and the ski area is basically the area of Kwajalein Lagoon, pictured sort of in varying degrees of zoom here, but it's the area north of Echo Pier, which is sort of on the bottom left-hand side of that image. And the site is in protected water, good viz, shallow, about 20 feet, and it had access points from the rocky embankment on the beach. Also, and very importantly, it was known to the local recreational dive community, and they had a lot of working knowledge about the site that could help us frame how we were going to approach the field school research. And so this knowledge sort of came to us from various sources, and as you can see, sort of the opinions varied as to what this wreck was. So the majority consensus was that it was a LCM, landing craft mechanized, of the 1500 class that broke its mooring or broke off from Echo Pier during Tropical Storm Zelda in 1991. Other thoughts was that it actually broke off during Typhoon Axel in 1992. Other opinions suggested that it might be the Neptune, which was a dive support platform that had a hyperbaric chamber on board. Another thought was that it was a DeLong barge that sank during 1979 in January during Tropical Storm Alice. And so this is probably the most likely candidate, that final one during Tropical Storm Alice, and I'll go into that in greater detail in a minute. So during Dr. Raup's recon trip in April, he was able to collect a really great GoPro video of the whole site. And so from that site, from that video, we were able to sort of compare it with historical images of LCMs that we could find on places like NavSource. And we began to notice there were some irregularities, notably in the pilot house, the forward gunwale, and the midship gunwale. And basically what we found was that rather than the LCM, this wreck actually more closely resembled the LCU, and specifically, or landing craft utility, and specifically an LCU of the 1466 class. So LCUs developed sort of from the landing craft tank, and all of these were sort of numbered sequentially. So the LCTs going up to Mark 6 were sort of numbered landing craft before 1465 below, and then it switched to the LCU 1466 for about 144 vessels until it was eventually succeeded by the 1610. And all of these are sort of derived offshoots typologically from one another. And both LCMs and LCUs, they can be easily confused because they have very similar appearance with the box-like hull and built-up gunnels, as well as prominent low-profile pilot houses that are centrally placed and adjacent to a raised poop deck. But LCUs, specifically 1466 LCUs, they measure a bit longer than LCMs at 115 feet, whereas the LCM variants, like the Mark 8, are about 73 feet. As I sort of said before, and as you could see in the image on the previous slide, one of the major differences was the built-up gunnel design, with the LCM types sort of having a built-up or sort of dry double-walled gunnel that was significantly thicker than that of the LCU types that had low freeboard and was lightly plated and mainly served as sort of a midship railing. But LCUs and LCMs of this type were built from the 1950s to the 1990s, though in 1957 the LCU craft were radically altered to become a larger type of vessel with a bow and a stern ramp that allowed for drive-through capabilities. And because of this drive-through capability, they shifted the pilot house and the deck house offset to the starboard side of the hull. So with the sort of knowledge that this likely represented a LCU of the 1466 class, we began to do a bit of digging into what those vessels did and were and how they worked. And we found that, I mean, these were really the workhorses of the fleet. They were used both by the Army and Navy, and they were one of the bigger, more versatile boats for ship-to-shore movement. And they could carry up to 160 tons of cargo through 12 foot of seas and deliver it safely to shore. They're really fantastic workboats, and they had a combat radius of 1,000 nautical miles, and they could operate independently for up to 10 days. And so, because of this versatility in how they could be used, you know, from primarily taking vehicles and transport and switching to personnel transport, they were used throughout the world very extensively. In the Marshall Islands, LCUs were used largely in the radiological cleanup of Agisoft Atoll after there was nuclear testing done on that island. They were also used for construction activities and for transportation services throughout the various atolls in the Marshall Islands. So now, sort of figuring out a little bit more about this vessel, that it's the ski area LCM represented an LCU of the 1466 class. We did a bit more historical research into what LCUs were in Kwajalein or in the Marshall Islands during this time, and like I said, there was only 144 of these this class of vessel built from 1466 to 1609. And so, they were all numbered sequentially, and so we were able to narrow the candidates down, and the most likely candidate is in the middle, LCU 1524, because a 1979 Kwajalein Hourglass article actually places LCU 24 as the vessel, the ski area LCM that wrecked in that proper location. And so, assuming LCU 24 signifies 1524, that's the most likely candidate for the vessel that we're looking at. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Richards.
Thanks, Jeremy. Hi, everyone. I'm Nathan Richards. I'll take over the rest of this presentation. So, armed with the information from Dr. Ralph's reconnaissance, Jeremy and I went on a hunt for builders' plans. We found them at ECU in a specific collection related to a North Carolina boat and shipbuilder that had been employed in repair and naval contracting since the Second World War. With these plans, we were able to build a very detailed, scaled model in McNeil's Rhinoceros program. Our intention was to build a very accurate very detailed model full of all the characteristics of the internal pontoon structure, but also including all the features on the deck, etc. And this would become our archetype that would allow us to plan the project and also would become the foundation for our analysis. Once we had vectorized all of the builder's plans in Adobe Illustrator and also built the model in Rhino, we used this as the foundation to extract a series of proforma or forms that our students would use in the field. We would do this primarily by extracting certain views from the original drawings, but also having to extract some model data. So for example, here we see 5 different proforma strung together with a degree of overlap that our students would use as the basis for orthographic drawings of the poop deck, the main deck structure, and the gunnel. Similarly, there would be ultimately around 20 different views of the profile. These would be the outboard and inboard perspectives of the port and starboard sides, again extracted from the builder's plans. And lastly, there were some perspectives in the builder's plans that we didn't have. These were the views from the bow to the stern, showing the ramp structure, also the view from the stern to the bow, showing the anchor cages of the propellers, etc. And the last view is the sort of the facade of the poop deck platform. These were taken directly from the model. Everything was scaled together and printed on Duracopy. This would be the foundation that our students would use in practicing traditional archaeological techniques, baseline and offset, trilateration, tape-based recording. Here you can see some images of our students at work going through methodologies much like any other field school. You see here one of the students, Patrick Smith, completing one of the proformas, undertaking extensive photography of any particular features of the wreck, and also going about doing baseline offset trilaterations to complete the proforma. We were lucky enough to have John McCord from the UNC Coastal Studies Institute on the DPA project, and he was able to come out to the site one day. He was able to use his Nikon D850, shoot almost 1700 high-resolution photographs, and from that we were able to construct an accurate photo model using Metashape. Of course, we can extract the usual products such as automosaics from that data set, and that can help us compare to the blueprints, but also the students can use that to help augment the results of their drafting. So we'd really intended to build the 3D model as a way of allowing us to get intimate knowledge of a site that we were yet to see. But of course, we ended up with 2 really good 3-dimensional data sets that were scaled and could be superimposed on one another. So we sort of saw these merged data sets, really the separate data sets and the merged data sets, as having potential as an analytical tool, not only for examining the manufacture of the vessels, the LCU 1466 class, and their function during wartime and peacetime, but also whether there were design deviations. We noticed a few things on the blueprints, and we were curious to see whether this would line up with what our 1466 example had. Those design deviations might give us insight to the changing use of these vessels throughout the time of their use. In line with this idea was the use life alterations. A lot of these craft, from the photographic evidence that we see, were heavily redesigned, altered, etc. And that's often related to their function and the changing function. Related to that was their modification for secondary uses, and this is sort of more related to the specific use of the LCU 1466s at Kwajalein Atoll. And so we were aware that maybe the photogrammetric data would give us some insight into that. The last 2 points here were really that there's a story about a particular LCU, it has a particular narrative about how it went down, and we're still interested in finding those definitive clues to identify the site. And so we're interested in the depositional processes and whether that could be reflected in the photogrammetric data. The last point is sort of an experimental point, I guess, is to say that maybe the three-dimensional data could inform managers about what they have at the site in areas that they can't see, for example, under sediment. Having all this information from the photographic record through to the model data gives us a lot of insight into the manufacture of the site, as well as perhaps changing functions. We see all kinds of details regarding its use. It was definitely a shipwreck. It's full of equipment that wasn't salvaged. And we also see some clues to maybe functional modifications while it was at Kwajalein Atoll, including things like reinforcing portholes, perhaps to stop damage during use. Comparison of the Rhino model and the photogrammetric data shows us immediate interesting features of this site. That first image is the Rhino model, the second image is the photogrammetric data. And you can see a whole range of things quite evidently by comparing them. We notice, for example, in the design documents that these vessels were planned to have storage for CO2 lifeboats and storage lockers in this location. Other photographic evidence that we have is that this was never installed on the majority, if any, of the 1466 craft. We see complete poop deck reconfiguration, multiple areas. This is very common with the 1466 class. They were sort of built with the intention to be armed, but the LCUs never really got used in that function. So this vessel either had the armament and the shielding removed, or it was never installed, even though we see the curvature of this gun emplacement still in the structure. We also see the anchor winch is different. We don't have the detailed winch dimensions, but we see that perhaps even an earlier type of winch from an LCT was installed on this particular LCU. Lastly, they intended to have anchor stowage adjacent to the anchor cage. That never happened. It looks like when they moved the CO2 life rafts from that previous position, they started to put life rafts and other things deployed off the stern of the vessel, and so we see that very clearly in comparing. Of course, some of the modifications are perhaps from the time in Kwajalein. We were very interested in one particular feature, which is this girder that's running across this aft section of the deck, right in front of the poop deck. The contention is that this is perhaps for loading skips onto the deck, and there's even the chance that this is at the area where radioactive material was loaded onto skips for the remediation after the nuclear tests in the adjacent atolls. There's a lot of photographic evidence pertaining to the wrecking of the ship. We see extensive areas of stoved-in hull plating, in addition to dented anchor cages, multiple locations where lines are still attached, probably in attempts to stop the vessel from wrecking. But the comparative model data also gives us the opportunity to maybe quantify these sorts of things. We can see the actual impact of the wrecking damage, in particular in the starboard side stern quarter. We can quantify what's missing. We can look at what's deteriorated as well as what's been removed. Things like the ramp are gone from the site. And perhaps we can even quantify the coral growth by comparing the model surfaces, the Rhino model surfaces with the photogrammetric surfaces. And perhaps there's even opportunities to correlate and quantify concretion and corrosion. Because we can superimpose the models and because we can extract orthographic projections from each of them, we are also able to look at things like the extent of burial. So we could perhaps think about what sections are below the sediment. There's a lot more to be said about this data, and we're continuing to look at it and analyze it. We found the methodology to be particularly useful for prepping ourselves in anticipation of a project in a far-flung place. We found it very useful for prepping our students ahead of time and getting them in the water, collecting data efficiently that we could then use in analyzing the site and its site formation. And we really found it to be, the modeling process in particular, to be a way that we could deepen our knowledge of a type of vessel that we weren't familiar with, and to really think about the forensic information that it represents, which would help us hopefully identify the site definitively in the future. There's a lot of people to thank. Most of all, I want to thank the staff at ECU and the students, our dive safety, Dr. Raup, etc. Thank you for listening.